The Quiet Panic. You guys have been asking me to cover this story for months now. And honestly, I kept putting it off because every time I started researching it, something felt deeply wrong about the whole thing. But after digging through police reports, witness testimonies, and some documents that probably shouldn't be public, I finally pieced together what happened with that violin case. And let me tell you, this is not the kind of story you expect when someone mentions a musical instrument. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when Marcus first saw the case sitting outside the estate sale. He'd been driving through one of those old money neighborhoods where every house looks like it could be featured in some Gothic horror movie. You know, the type of place where the trees are just a little too perfectly manicured and the silence feels heavier than it should. Marcus was what you'd call a professional treasure hunter. Not the Indiana Jones kind, but the guy who shows up to estate sales at dawn hoping to find that one antique worth 20 times what the sellers think it's worth. The Whitmore estate was having their sale that day. Old Victorian mansion, 3 stories with more rooms than any normal family would ever need. The kind of place where secrets collect in corners and dust settles on things that should probably stay buried. Mrs. Whitmore had passed away the previous month, and her relatives just wanted everything gone as quickly as possible. That should have been Marcus's first red flag, but when you're in his line of work, you learn to ignore those kinds of warning signs. He'd already been through most of the house, picking up a few decent pieces, but nothing that would pay his rent for the month. That's when he walked out to the back porch and saw it sitting there all by itself. A violin case, but not just any violin case. This thing was gorgeous in the most unsettling way possible. Deep mahogany wood with brass corners that had this weird green patina, like they'd been aging for decades longer than they should have been. The leather handle was cracked but still solid, and there were these intricate carvings along the edges that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Marcus had been around enough antiques to recognize quality craftsmanship when he saw it. This case was easily from the early 1900s, maybe even late 1800s, and in remarkable condition considering its age. But what really caught his attention was the price tag, $20. $20 for something that should have been priced at least 10 times higher. Either the family had no idea what they were selling, or there was something very wrong with it that wasn't immediately obvious. He picked up the case to examine it more closely, and that's when he noticed the weight was all wrong. It was way too heavy for an empty violin case, but when he shook it gently, nothing moved inside. No rattling, no sliding sounds, just this dense, solid weight that seemed to pull downward more than physics would suggest. The latches were tarnished brass with tiny keyholes, but they weren't locked. They looked like they hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. Marcus tried to lift one of the latches and it wouldn't budge, not because it was locked, but because it felt fused shut, like the metal had somehow grown together over time. He tried the other latch with the same result. The case was sealed tight, but not in any way that made mechanical sense. It was like the thing was holding itself closed. Any reasonable person would have walked away at that point. But Marcus had been doing this for 15 years, and his instincts were telling him that whatever was inside this case was worth far more than $20. Maybe it was a Stradivarius that the family didn't know they had. Maybe it was some other rare instrument worth hundreds of thousands. The possibilities were making his palms sweat despite the cool autumn air. He found the woman running the sale, Mrs. Whitmore's niece, a tired-looking lady in her 50s who seemed eager to get rid of everything as quickly as possible. When Marcus asked about the violin case, her expression changed immediately. Not to suspicion or protectiveness, but to something that looked almost like relief. "Oh, that old thing," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Aunt Eleanor always kept it in her music room, but I never saw her open it. Honestly, I'm surprised someone finally wants it. Most people who pick it up end up putting it right back down." That comment should have been another red flag, but Marcus was already pulling out his wallet. As he handed over the $20, the niece grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers were ice cold, and when she spoke, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Whatever you do," she said, staring directly into his eyes, "don't try to force it open. If it's meant to be opened, it'll open when it's ready, but if it doesn't want to open, then it shouldn't be opened. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Marcus nodded, though he had no idea what she meant. The woman released his wrist and quickly took the money, then practically fled back into the house. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the violin case in his hands, wondering what exactly he'd just purchased. But the weight of it, the craftsmanship, the obvious age and quality, all of that convinced him he'd made a good investment. The drive home was when things started getting weird. Marcus had thrown the case in his back seat, and every time he glanced in his rearview mirror, it seemed like the case had shifted position slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to make him question whether he was remembering correctly where he'd placed it. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he was convinced the case had somehow rotated 90 degrees from how he'd originally set it down. His house was a small craftsman bungalow that he'd converted into part workshop, part showroom for his antique business. He had a dedicated room where he cleaned and restored pieces before selling them, complete with proper lighting and all the tools he'd need to work on something as delicate as an old violin case. He carried the case inside and set it on his main workbench, then just stared at it for a while. Under the bright workshop lights, the carvings on the case were even more intricate than he'd initially thought. They weren't just decorative flourishes, but seemed to tell some kind of story. There were figures that looked almost human, but not quite, twisted into poses that suggested either extreme agony or ecstatic joy. It was impossible to tell which. The brass corners had symbols etched into them that Marcus didn't recognize, but they made him uncomfortable to look at for too long. He tried the latches again, using some of his finer tools to see if he could coax them open without damaging the case, but it was like trying to separate two pieces of metal that had been welded together. There was no give whatsoever, no sense that they were meant to move at all. After an hour of careful attempts, Marcus gave up and decided to research the case instead. That's when he found the first newspaper article. The headline read, "Local musician dies in mysterious circumstances," and was dated October 15th, 1934. Marcus had to squint at the old microfilm scan, but the details were clear enough. A violinist named Theodore Ashworth had been found dead in his apartment, and the only thing missing from the scene was his prized violin and its case. The article mentioned that neighbors had reported hearing the most beautiful and terrible music coming from his apartment for 3 days straight before the silence that led to the discovery of his body. What made Marcus's blood run cold was the description of the missing case. Deep mahogany with brass corners, intricate carvings, and an unusual weight. It was his case, no doubt about it. But that was just the beginning. More articles followed, each one more disturbing than the last. 31, a music teacher in Chicago found dead, same missing case description. 47, a young prodigy in Boston discovered in his practice room with all his fingers broken, the mysterious violin case nowhere to be found. 63, an entire family of musicians in New Orleans all found in their living room arranged in a circle around where a violin case should have been. Every single incident followed the same pattern. Someone would acquire the case, usually from an estate sale or auction. They'd try to open it. They'd become obsessed with whatever was inside. And then they'd disappear or turn up dead under circumstances that made no sense. Marcus spent the next 3 hours reading everything he could find about the case. Police reports, witness statements, even some academic papers written by folklore researchers who'd become interested in what they called the Ashworth phenomenon. The deeper he dug, the more convinced he became that he was sitting 3 feet away from something that had been killing people for nearly a century. But here's the thing about obsession. The more you know you should walk away from something, the harder it becomes to actually do it. Marcus found himself staring at the case for hours that first night, running his fingers along those carved figures, feeling the weight of whatever was trapped inside. The rational part of his brain was screaming at him to get rid of it, to take it to the police or throw it in a dumpster or do literally anything except keep it in his house. The irrational part, though, was whispering that maybe all those other people had just done something wrong. Maybe they'd forced it when they should have been patient. Maybe they'd tried to break it open instead of finding the right way to unlock it. Maybe Marcus was different. Maybe he was meant to be the one who finally solved the mystery. On the second night, Marcus woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of music. Not from outside, not from a neighbor's house, but from somewhere inside his own home. It was violin music, but unlike anything he'd ever heard before. The melody was beautiful but wrong somehow, like it was being played backwards or in a key that shouldn't exist. He followed the sound through his house, and it led him directly to his workshop. The case was exactly where he'd left it, still sealed tight, but the music was definitely coming from inside it. Marcus stood there in his pajamas, listening to this impossible concert being performed by an instrument that should have been locked away and silent. The music seemed to respond to his presence, growing louder and more complex, as if whatever was inside knew he was listening. That's when he noticed his tools had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted around his workbench in ways that suggested someone had been examining them. Someone had been trying to figure out how to open the case from the inside. The music stopped abruptly, leaving Marcus alone in the sudden silence of his workshop. He reached out toward the case, his hand trembling, and as his fingers touched the mahogany surface, he could swear he felt something moving underneath the wood. Not the violin itself, but something else. something that felt almost like a heartbeat. Marcus jerked his hand back and stumbled out of the workshop, slamming the door behind him. He spent the rest of the night sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee and trying to convince himself that he'd been dreaming. But when morning came and he went back to check on the case, he found fresh scratches on the inside of the latches. Something had been trying to get out. The third night was when everything went to hell. Marcus had decided he was going to get rid of the case. He'd researched the addresses of the previous owners, the families who'd lost people to this thing, and he was going to return it to one of them with a full explanation and an apology. But when he went to his workshop to collect it, the case was gone. He tore his house apart looking for it, checked every room, every closet, even the garage and the basement. Nothing. The case had simply vanished, leaving behind only the indentation on his workbench where it had been sitting. Marcus was starting to think maybe he really had been losing his mind when he heard the music again. This time it was coming from his bedroom. The case was sitting on his bed, positioned exactly in the center of his mattress, like it had been carefully placed there. The latches were still closed, but now they looked different somehow. Looser, like they were finally ready to open after all these years of being sealed shut. Marcus knew he should run. Every instinct he had was telling him to get out of the house and never come back. But the music was so beautiful, and he'd come so far, and he was so close to finally understanding what had been driving people to madness for nearly a century. He sat on the edge of his bed and reached for the first latch. It opened easily, like it had been waiting for him all along. The second latch followed without any resistance. Marcus took a deep breath, said a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and slowly lifted the lid of the violin case. The police found him the next morning when he didn't show up to an appointment with a client. Marcus was sitting on his bed perfectly still with the open case in his lap. His eyes were wide and staring, and there was a smile on his face that his neighbors later described as the most peaceful and terrifying expression they'd ever seen on a human being. The case was empty, completely, impossibly empty. No violin, no bow, no rosin or strings or any of the things you'd expect to find. Just dark red velvet lining and the lingering scent of something that might have been roses or might have been blood. Marcus was still alive, technically. His heart was beating, he was breathing, all his vital signs were normal. But he never spoke again, never moved from that position, never showed any sign that he was aware of the world around him. The doctors called it a catatonic state brought on by severe psychological trauma. His family eventually had him committed to a long-term care facility where he sits to this day, still smiling that same peaceful, terrifying smile. The violin case disappeared from the crime scene before the police could properly catalog it as evidence. 3 days later, it turned up at an estate sale in the next town over, sitting on a back porch with a $20 price tag, waiting for the next person who thought they were clever enough to solve its mystery. And that's the thing about some doors, some cases, some secrets that we're not meant to understand. They don't exist to be opened. They exist to test whether we're wise enough to leave them alone. Marcus failed that test, just like Theodore Ashworth before him, just like dozens of others whose stories never made it into the newspapers. The violin case is still out there somewhere, still waiting, still sealed tight with whatever darkness lives inside it. And every time someone thinks they're the exception, every time someone believes they're different from all the people who came before, that case finds its way to them. So if you ever find yourself at an estate sale and you see a beautiful mahogany violin case with brass corners and intricate carvings and the price seems too good to be true, just remember Marcus. Remember that some things are sealed shut for a reason, and maybe, just maybe, walk away while you still can. Because the violin case you must not open is always the one that wants to be opened the most.